I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm David Barton.
And we're here in Philadelphia, and this is behind us Independence Hall. This is a place where they actually constructed the Constitution. And you know, today, many people don't even know what the Constitution is, what it says, what it stands for, but behind us is where they put all that together.
And it's a remarkable document. The rest of the world goes through a new Constitution every 17 years, and we've had the same one for over 2 centuries. Why? And what do we know about those who put together this document?
This is America's hidden history.
Modern historians have revised, rewritten, and even deleted entire chapters of American history. So what are we missing? What happened to the history that didn't make the books? Join historian David Barton, Tim Barton, and special guests as they uncover the facts some historians don't want you to know. This is America's hidden history.
On September 17th, 1787, the U.S. Constitution was signed. And since we're talking about Constitution Day, it's a good time to look back on the anniversary of the Constitution and say, so what is this all about? Why did we do a Constitution? Where did it come from? Why was it important?
Well, we did the Constitution because we wanted a governing document that was written that gave fixed laws. As John Adams told us, this was going to be a government of laws, not of men. And so we had fixed laws that would apply to everyone. So writing it down was very important to these guys. Now, once you have it written down, you need to know what's there. Otherwise, you can't enforce the provisions of the law. And that's where it kind of gets tricky today, because previous generations, we really did emphasize knowing the Constitution. If you go all the way back to the 1940s, there was what was called Citizenship Day. That was a celebration of the Constitution, but it was particularly because Americans already knew the Constitution. But all these immigrants that come in, they've learned the Constitution, they want to be citizens, so we called Constitution Day Citizenship Day. In 1952, under Harry Truman, they expanded it and they made it Constitution and Citizenship Day. And so we wanted to emphasize the Constitution, but also citizenship that goes with it. And then we got so bad as Americans not knowing our own document that by the time you get to 2004, Senator Robert Byrd out of West Virginia added a provision and said, okay, here's the deal. If you get federal funds, if you're a federal agency or if you're a school that gets federal funds, on September the 17th, at your school, you're going to have a special program on the Constitution to make sure every student knows it. And so that's what really led to Constitution Day. Officially, it's still called Citizenship and Constitution Day, but knowing the Constitution has always been seen as something very important for Americans.
Well, even though that became law in 2004, still not many Americans today know much about the U.S. Constitution. In fact, if you look at the First Amendment, there are 5 freedoms protected in the First Amendment. Only 1 in 1,000 people can name all 5. So here's trivia. How many can you name? If you go in order, you have religion, you have speech, you have press, you have assembly, and you have petition. But only 1 in 1,000 people even know what's there. In fact, if you look at something even easier, the 3 branches of government, 62% of Americans cannot identify, cannot name the 3 branches of government. And that's not really hard. I mean, there's 3, right? You have the executive, the legislative, and judicial.
And that's the first 3 articles of the Constitution. First article of the Constitution is about the legislative. Second article is about the executive. And third article is about the judiciary. So that's most of the Constitution right there.
And yet most Americans cannot name that. And actually,
it gets worse than that.
Right.
48% of elected officials cannot name the 3 branches of government.
Yeah, and if you don't know what's in the Constitution, you certainly don't know what your rights are. You don't know what even what your responsibilities are, and we're certainly not going to protect and defend what should be our rights and freedoms if we don't even know what's there. So what we need to do is let's take a little look back. Let's go back and study the men who gave us the Constitution. Let's study some details of the Constitution to know what this document is all about.
We're in the home of Gani Bedford Jr. Gani Bedford Jr. was a signer of the Constitution from Delaware. Now, interestingly enough, Delaware wasn't a state when the American Revolution started. They were considered the lower counties of Pennsylvania, but when we separated from Great Britain, Delaware became its own independent state. This is called Lombardy Hall. This is where Gani Bedford moved in 1793. He was born in 1747, and he went to Princeton University, and he graduated in 1771. And one of his fellow graduates that year was James Madison, another signer of the Constitution. and they were both taught by the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Well, after he finishes school, he comes back, he becomes an attorney, and shortly after he becomes an attorney, the American Revolution breaks out. Gunning becomes a soldier in the American Revolution, and actually, according to his daughter, he was an aide to George Washington during the Revolution. In the midst of the Revolution, he is elected the first Attorney General of Delaware. In 1783, he's elected both to the State Assembly and to the Continental Congress. And being in the Continental Congress, he gets to see firsthand the difficulties with the national government under the Articles of Confederation. So he's one of the guys that works to move to a new government, and in 1787, he's one of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He was one of the most consistent members there. He was there just time after time, day after day. The attendance records show that he was there. He was a faithful attendant. And he so liked the Constitution that when it came to the states for ratification, he's one of the very few delegates who had signed the Constitution who went into the state to be a ratifying delegate for the Constitution. When the Constitution took effect in 1789, George Washington appointed Gani Bedford Jr. as the first federal judge over Delaware, and that's a position he held for the rest of his life. Interesting, through his latter years, he was very involved in the abolition movement. In fact, in Delaware, he was one of the key members of the Delaware Abolition Society, and he was also very outspoken about his faith. For example, when George Washington died in 1799, Gani Bedford gave the oration here commemorating George Washington. That was his commander-in-chief, that was the president of the Constitutional Convention, he was the father of his country. And when Gani Bedford had gone through all this about George Washington, recalling him to everyone knew him back then. I mean, he was the most famous guy of the day. When Gani Bedford finished that oration, this is the way he closed. He said, "Now, to the triune God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, be ascribed all honor and dominion forevermore. Amen." What a way to close the oration of the most famous man of the day. But that was part of the faith of Gani Bedford Jr., who's one of the signers of the Constitution, and sadly, he's one of the guys we rarely hear about today. There were 39 guys who signed the Constitution, 55 who helped write it. We know 2 or 3 generally today, but we don't know Gani Bedford. We should. He's one of the strong founding fathers who helped make us the nation that we are today.
So we are at the home, or at least the location where it used to be the home of Benjamin Franklin. You see the metal structures behind me. Those are the outline of the buildings that used to be here that Benjamin Franklin built. Now, Benjamin Franklin was a guy who signed the Declaration, went on and signed the Constitution, one of very few guys that actually did that. But Benjamin Franklin was a noted leader throughout our nation for a lot of years. Now, people recognize today he was a printer. During the Revolution, did a lot of printing, and throughout his time as a printer, he actually became friends with a man named George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield was the famous evangelist from the First Great Awakening. Well, Franklin printed a lot of Whitefield's sermons, and in printing his sermons, he read a lot of Whitefield's sermons. He and Whitefield became friends. In fact, Franklin wanted to build an addition on his house to give Whitefield a place to live and stay. So Whitefield had a major influence in Franklin's life when early on he lived a fairly secular life. In fact, we could joke and call him maybe like the early Donald Trump of his era and some of the way he lived, but after George Whitefield, you see a decided change in his life. We separated from Great Britain in 1776. Franklin's one of the guys that helped do the Pennsylvania Constitution. He's a leader in Pennsylvania at the time. He is a governor of Pennsylvania, goes on the Constitution. Now, the Constitution, when things aren't working and it seems like everything's falling apart, there's so much frustration, so many problems, Franklin's the guy that suggests, maybe we ought to pray and ask God for help. In fact, the longest speech he gave to the Constitutional Convention was the challenging of the other delegates that let's pray and ask God for help, because without God's help, we're not going to succeed in this. Franklin's a really interesting guy today. Although he's recognizable in name, a lot of people don't know his contributions, and especially the fact that even though he was the least religious founding father, he still believed we needed God to be a part of what we did in the nation, or we wouldn't be successful.
We We are just outside of Dover, Delaware, at the home of John Dickinson, a signer of the U.S. Constitution. John Dickinson is not one we really talk about today, but we should. He was a huge factor in the American founding. He was a name that was well known back in his day. He's a name worth rediscovering today. Let's go inside, show you some more. John Dickinson is known as a founding father from Delaware. But actually, at the time of the American Revolution, Delaware was part of Pennsylvania. It was considered the lower counties of Pennsylvania. In 1776, when we declared independence, Delaware became its own state. So he was born in 1732, and in growing up, he grew up largely right here in this house. He was home educated, and he had an inclination to study law. So he began studying law. He actually went to England and studied law in England. He came back in 1757. He was licensed as an attorney. Within only 5 years, he was such an exceptional attorney that he was already arguing cases at the colonial Supreme Court, which is a big deal. Only 3 years later, the tensions between America and Great Britain were growing to the point that we had what was called the Stamp Act and the non-importation agreements, etc. And he early took the side of the colonists against the British. As a matter of fact, he began writing pieces in favor of the colonists. These are some of the early pieces he did. These are from 1768. These are letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania to the British citizens. And so he's explaining the problems that we're having and why we have this conflict going on. And by the way, pieces like that is what caused him to be called the penman of the American Revolution. It seemed like that if there was something that needed to be said, he wrote it down and Congress said, that's what we wanted to say. And so time after time after time, he was the one who wrote the official letters going to the king or the petitions to the king. He was the penman of the American Revolution. It's interesting that being in Pennsylvania as he was, and then in Delaware after 1776, he's in the same state with Ben Franklin. But he and Ben Franklin were often on opposite sides of many, many issues. They both loved America, both great guys. But you had John Dickinson, who was much more cautious, much more reserved, and you had Ben Franklin, who was much more bold and much more decisive. And so whereas John Dickinson wanted to try to reconcile and conciliate, Ben Franklin is saying, let's separate, let's be independent. And so as this goes back and forth, when you get to the time of 1776, when we did the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson is a delegate there. At the time we vote for independence, except he did not vote for independence. John Dickinson did not vote to do the Declaration of Independence. He thought it was premature. We needed more time. And of course, Ben Franklin did vote for the Declaration. So it's significant that at that point you see kind of the character of these two guys. And it wasn't that John Dickinson was afraid of what was coming, because right after we approved the Declaration, he goes out and picks up a gun and he goes out to take on the British. As a matter of fact, out of all the guys who approved the Declaration, only 2 guys picked up guns to go after the British. One was Thomas McKee, and also from here in Delaware, and the other was John Dickinson. So these 2 guys are very strong patriots. It's interesting that John Dickinson, with all his notoriety, he went in as a private. He just went into the military as a private, and before long he's all the way up to a general. So a very significant guy. But once the American Revolution is over, he's been in the Continental Congress. He saw the problems we had with the government, the Articles of Confederation. He knew that we needed something better. And so he starts being part of the movement to get toward a constitution. That began with the Annapolis Convention of 1786. And by the way, 1786 is also when John Dickinson freed his slaves. Well, in 1787, we moved from the Annapolis Convention to the Constitutional Convention, and John Dickinson is a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He spoke 50 times throughout the convention. He was an active participant in it. When the Constitution was finally written and everybody approved it, he was one of the 39 signers. It then went to the states to be ratified. And when it went to the states, here came his penmanship again, because he starts writing more pieces, explaining to the people why this needs to be ratified, why we need this Constitution. And the Constitution does eventually get ratified. In 1791, he was actually the president of the convention that wrote the Delaware Constitution. So he has a long political life, was involved in many things. And after you get to 1791, the next 17 years of his life, he's really not much involved in political things anymore. Now, he's still very active and still does a lot of stuff, but think about this guy. I mean, he was from Pennsylvania, but then Delaware became a state, so now he's from Delaware. But even being from Delaware, it's amazing. He was elected to the state legislature from both Delaware and from Pennsylvania. And he was elected to the Continental Congress both by Delaware and by Pennsylvania. And he served in the Continental Army both as a soldier from Delaware and a soldier from Pennsylvania. And he was the governor of Delaware, elected by the people, and was elected by Pennsylvania to be the governor of Pennsylvania. You can't find another governor who's been governor of 2 separate states like that. I mean, what an amazing guy, but both states loved him, both states saw him as very significant. And he also was a strong man of faith. A lot of ways to illustrate that. One of the things he did was he was one of the funders of the 1798 Bible that was known as the Hot Press Bible. That Bible was the largest Bible ever done in America to that point, and he's one of the guys who helped fund it. This is also a proclamation that he did while he was governor of Pennsylvania. And it's a proclamation saying, hey guys, we need to observe the Sabbath. Sabbath is really important that we observe it. And here's the governor calling the people to observe the Sabbath in Pennsylvania. So his faith was very evident. But there's no question that John Dickinson was a very significant founding father. We don't know much about him today, which is unfortunate. We should, because he played a huge role in making us the nation that we are today with the freedoms and liberties that we celebrate on Constitution Day.
There's no more famous name in American history than that of George Washington, and rightfully so. If you go back in American history, nobody was more involved from the American Revolution to the Constitutional Convention, all the way up to we become a nation and we have a president. Nobody did more than George Washington, so it's fair that his name would be the most famous, and yet with a famous name, very few people know the story of George Washington. Very few people know that when he was a boy, his father died. In fact, living on a farm, he and his brother and his mom, they're trying to figure things out. When he was just a teenager, he starts off his business as a surveyor, and that's what he does full time. One of the cool things he did a book that's known today as Washington's Rules of Civility. It's actually 110 lessons on manners and moral decency of good behavior in company. So what should you do around people? Well, he wrote a book on exactly what you should do. Actually, he copied 110 of these virtues. Nonetheless, this became very famous from Washington. Well, Washington then, as a young man, he's part of the military, he's part of the French and Indian War, becomes a colonel in the French and Indian War. After the French and Indian War, he retires, he goes back and he lives on the farm at Mount Vernon, and he's there really until the American Revolution breaks out. He's a member of the First Continental Congress. He was unanimously selected to be the commander-in-chief of our military, gets us all the way through the Revolution, turns in his commission at the end of the Revolution. After he's led our military to victory, many of the officers said, Washington, you should just be the king because we don't trust Congress. Those guys are corrupt. We don't like them. You just be our king. And he said, guys, we fought a war to get out from under kings. We don't need a king. He turned in his resignation. Amazing act of humility, a recognition of what our nation needed. Well, he then goes back home when we realize after the Articles of Confederation have failed and we need something more. He is then chosen to be the leader at the Constitutional Convention. After a state says, actually, we want you to go be a delegate for us, represent our state, the Constitutional Convention, they say, we need you to lead this. And it was his leadership that led all of the men in the room who had different opinions. They argued constantly. For weeks, they argued over what should be done. It was George Washington's leadership that actually led to us having a Constitution. At the end of the Constitutional Convention, George Washington was then unanimously elected to be the president. In fact, he was unanimously elected his second time to be the president. People recognize this man is amazing. He's an incredible leader. And at the end of 2 terms, he was actually chosen to reign again, as the case were, right? To be president again. He says, guys, no. Don't vote for me again. We don't need to have somebody who is constantly in power. We need a turnover of power. That way we can protect our republic. So he steps down after 2 terms. This man's leadership was absolutely amazing. And yet, again, today, so few people know many of his stories. One of my favorite stories when it comes to his military service goes back to when he was just a young colonel in the French and Indian War. In fact, at this time, when General Braddock was sent over by the British, there was a battle going on for the Middle Territory in the U.S. at the time, and the French were fighting the British for who was going to get much of the territory. So when General Braddock, who was the British commander, came to America, he'd heard stories of George Washington and was told, you need him on your staff. George Washington became his aide-de-camp for the British general. Well, when Washington came to fame was actually a moment when the British general, they were sent to go to Fort Duquesne and drive out the French forces. On the way, Washington, who's in charge of the Virginia Buckskins, who is apparently like a bunch of rednecks with guns, who joined the military, joined the British, General Braddock is told that there might be some Indians and some French hiding in the woods to ambush us. Maybe we should send a delegation ahead, a scouting party, and go see it. And General Braddock says, guys, we don't need to do that. Told Washington, we really don't need your help. We don't need the help of your friendly Indians. We're fine. Well, the problem was on the march to this fort, they were ambushed. The ambush was so significant that every single mounted officer was killed in that battle except one. George Washington was the only mounted officer to survive that attack. In fact, when General Braddock was shot down, George Washington was assigned and given position as commander of the forces. Now, when Washington was given position of commander, he realized this is a terrible situation. We need to get out of here. He led the retreat back to the fort where they had come from. When he got back to the fort, he said he took off his jacket and there were 4 bullet holes through his jacket. Another report says that he was brushing his hair and bullet fragments came out of his hair. He wrote that 2 horses had been shot out from under him. This account was absolutely amazing. In fact, what's even equally amazing is several years later, there was a group of Indians that came and they met George Washington in the woods. And they said, you don't know us, but many years ago, we were in these very woods together, and we were part of the enemy that was fighting against you. We told our braves to single you out and fire at you because we knew if we could kill you, we could scatter the troops, we could massacre them all. One chief said, I personally fired my rifle at you 17 times. A rifle which, but for you, knew not how to miss. He said, I came all this way just to meet the man that God would not let die in battle. And true to the story, George Washington never died in battle. His entire military career, so many close encounters, and yet God kept him safe through every bit of it. Among the many impressive character traits of George Washington that are largely forgotten today, one of those is his faith. Now, today, some people might acknowledge that, he believed in God, maybe like divine providence. Really, probably, though, it's more accurate to describe him as a deist. At least that's what some people might argue today. What's interesting, though, is historically, George Washington was always considered to be a Christian. In fact, really, there wasn't a lot of doubt in that for especially the people that knew him. In fact, there were many books written about George Washington and his Christian faith. Well, one of the guys who did the most probably with the writings of George Washington was a guy named Jared Sparks. In fact, he's the first guy to ever really compile the writings of George Washington, and it was a mini-volume set because there were a lot of letters of George Washington. Now, the writings of Washington have grown since the original works of Jared Sparks because there have been many more letters that people have found from George Washington, and so they've been added to the list. One of the cool things Jared Sparks did, though, was he actually wrote the people that knew George Washington personally. He wrote other generals. He wrote other political leaders. He even wrote family members and said, hey, can you tell me, what did George Washington think about this issue or this topic or this subject? Well, one of the things that Jared Sparks wanted to know was, where did Washington really stand when it comes to Christianity? Because he knew the impression he had, but he thought, I want to know what the people that knew George Washington thought about him. One of the family members he wrote to was Nellie Parke Custis. Now, Nellie Parke Custis was actually the granddaughter of George Washington's wife, Martha Custis, and George Washington and Martha actually adopted her, and she came and lived with them and their family. Well, after living with George Washington for many years, she had a pretty good look into his life. So Jared Sparks wrote and said, can you tell me about his Christian faith? Was he a Christian? Did he really believe in that? And I want to read you part of a letter, what she wrote back to Jared Sparks about the faith of George Washington. She said, I should have thought it a greatest heresy to doubt his firm belief in Christianity. His life, his writings prove that he was a Christian. She says, in my mind, there's no doubt. Now, she gives several examples why, but here's how she concludes the letter. She says, is it necessary that anyone should certify General Washington avowed himself to me a believer in Christianity? As well, may we question his patriotism. According to Nellie Custis, you might as well question the patriotism of George Washington if you start questioning his Christianity. That's how clear his Christianity was, because nobody is going to question the patriotism of George Washington, but neither should we question his Christianity.
We now find ourselves in Orange County, Virginia. And right behind me is Montpelier. That is the home of James Madison, who was the signer of the Constitution. He's also the 4th president of the United States. Now, the center part of the house, the taller part there, kind of blocking the middle, was built by his father, James Madison Sr. The 2 wings were added by James Madison Jr., the signer and the president, when he came back after his presidency. Interesting bit of trivia. In the home behind us here at Montpelier actually lived a big Hollywood A-list star, Randolph Scott, who had more than 100 movies. He was married to one of the Madison descendants. In 1817, having finished his presidency, James Madison retired back to Montpelier after 40 years of public service. But that doesn't mean he was retired and not doing anything. As a matter of fact, he came back in time to help his friend Thomas Jefferson, who had recently founded the University of Virginia. James Madison became a visitor or a regent for the University of Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson assigned him with finding good theological books to put in the library. And James Madison, with his prior study as a minister, when he thought he might be a minister, knew all sorts of books, and so got that in the university library. And then when Thomas Jefferson died, James Madison actually became the second rector for the University of Virginia. Also, while he was retired back here, the Missouri Compromise question came up. Prior to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Congress, the National Congress, had been working to end slavery. And so you had the Northwest Ordinance that said you can't have any federal territory with slavery. You had the banning the exportation of slaves, banning the importation of slaves. They were trying to reduce it. In 1820, Congress said, no, let's go the other way. Let's expand slavery. And so what they said is, these federal territories where we said you couldn't have slavery, let's let some slaves be there. And so we started accepting states in the United States that were pro-slavery. And instead of slavery reducing, it was now growing, and that was a great concern to James Madison. He actually predicted that that would lead to a conflict between the free states and the slave states, a civil war. And so he was accurate in that. You look at all he did as a signer of the Constitution, as one of the master builders of the Constitution, as a leader in securing religious liberties, and also as a leader in trying to secure the end of slavery. James Madison was a significant founding father. James Madison, like many of Virginia's founding fathers, owned slaves. In fact, you can see some of the slave quarters right here behind me at Montpelier. Now, Madison, like many of Virginia's founding fathers, did not like slavery, did not want to be part of slavery, but they were. James Madison actually said he went off to study for the law because he wanted to have some trade that did not depend on slaves. So if he owned slaves, though, why not just set them free? Because in Virginia, the state law was very, very, very complicated. It's kind of like the IRS code today. I mean, there's so many provisions. There was a period in 1782 they passed an emancipation law that you could set your slaves free, but in 1785 they repealed that, and it just went on and on. If you had dowry slaves, which are slaves inherited by the wife, then they can never be freed. And if you wanted a slave freed, it had to be for meritorious service, and the legislature had to determine that. Matter of fact, one of the great black heroes of the American Revolution, James Armistead, his owner freed him at the end of the Revolution, but he still wasn't free because it took an act of the Virginia legislature individually to free him. As an example of how complicated the laws were, in 1791, Robert Carter, who owned 500 slaves here in Virginia, was part of a revival meeting where he heard the gospel of Christ. He became a Christian. He said, I'm going to release all 500 of my slaves. He was very wealthy. He released them all. 60 years later, they're still working to release the 500 slaves that he freed. So it's a very complicated situation, and that's really where Madison found himself. And in this part of the country, they had a different approach. Up north, they wanted emancipation, period. Never was a time in Massachusetts when blacks couldn't vote. In the Deep South, there's never going to be emancipation. But here in the central colonies, it's like, we want slaves freed, but man, there's so much racism here that I guess the best way to do that is maybe have colonization societies and send them back to Africa where there's not so much prejudice. So there really were different approaches to how to solve the problem. And so James Madison, looking at this, was really kind of stuck with something he didn't want to be part of, but he had it. But he worked at the Constitutional Convention to make sure the word slavery did not enter the Constitution. As he said, he didn't want the Constitution tainted with that word. So he kept the word out because he did think that slavery was a taint on America, and he didn't want it tainting the Constitution. And he also worked on anti-slavery laws. Now, being in Virginia, none of them got passed. Thomas Jefferson introduced an abolition law here. It got voted down in the legislature. George Washington worked for abolition. It got voted down. So in Virginia, they could not get those policies passed, but Madison, stuck with having this great evil that he didn't like, actually did what he could to a degree. I mean, he still had slavery, and that's still bad, but he looked at slaves as if they were members of his family. He called them his family. And actually, he would not allow any slave to be sold unless with the permission of that slave. So working in a really bad system with a really bad evil, he did what he could, but he certainly tried to work to do what he could to bring emancipation.
Knowing they were people who cared about faith, because you see proclamations, you see Bibles and Bible societies, then it's no surprise that when we look at the Constitution, we actually find the influence of the Bible in the Constitution.
And we've had our Constitution now for centuries, literally. We are the oldest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. You know what the average length of a Constitution in the history of the world is? Every other nation, average length of a Constitution is 17 years. Oh my gosh. In the same period of time we've had our Constitution, France has had 15. I mean, you just go through the other nations, and we are so different. We're so blessed. And so political scientists say, America Constitution is different from everybody else's. It works different. Where'd they get their ideas? And so political science professors said, you know, if we read the writings of the Founding Fathers and see who they quoted, we'll know where they got their ideas. And so their idea was we'll take 15,000 of their writings, we'll read those writings and see who they quote, and they did. And they found 3,154 direct quotes in those writings. They took every one of those quotes back to their original sources. It took them 10 years to do it, but they did it. And this is the report that they came out with, The Origins of American Constitutionalism. Now, given the fact that you have millions of books that have been written over all recorded history, and you got a lot of people you can quote from, you might have tens of thousands of sources of ideas. What they found was the number one person quoted most often was Charles Montesquieu. He did these books right here. This is Spirit of Laws from 1750. He got 8.3% of all the quotes. The second most quoted source was William Blackstone, Commentaries on the Laws. It was 7.9% of the quotes. The third most quoted individual was John Locke. This book goes back to 1690. So those are your top 3 cited individuals. But that was not the most cited source. 4 times more often than any individual is they cited the Bible. So you say, oh my gosh, there's a lot of ideas that came out of the Bible. Yeah, there is. As a matter of fact, a lot of governments had 3 branches of government, and that goes back to Isaiah 33:22. But nobody had done what America did of separating the branches and having checks and balances. You know, it's interesting that John Adams wrote about that and why they did checks and balances, and he pointed to Jeremiah 17:9 as the reason that we created checks and balances and separation of powers. Now, how many today would know that Jeremiah 17:9 played such a substantial role?
Sure, and he wasn't the only one that did that, because he actually wrote 3 letters where he says the reason we can't centralize power is because the heart of man is wicked and deceitful, and you can't trust the heart of man. Well, that's actually what Jeremiah 17:9 says, but George Washington wrote that, Alexander Hamilton wrote that. The Founding Fathers were pretty clear on this idea of why we had to separate powers, of checks and balances, and it was because of what the Bible taught in Jeremiah 17:9.
And you find provisions in the Constitution. For example, the Constitution addresses death penalty twice. And when it talks about death penalty, like with treason, it says you cannot put anybody to death for treason. You can't use death penalty unless you have 2 overt eyewitnesses to the act.
Now, that wasn't true in Europe. In Europe, you could make an accusation. In fact, you didn't have to prove them guilty. There wasn't even a real court of law and the process and facing your accusers. And we did it different in America. You said you have to have at least 2 witnesses.
And the Bible says you can't put someone to death unless you have 2 witnesses, Deuteronomy 17. If you read that article in the Constitution and you read Deuteronomy 17, you go, that's the same wording. Yes, it is.
One of the other provisions you see in the Constitution is something related to the way we even choose a leader. And the reason we choose a leader, actually, as president, you have to be a natural-born American citizen. And why would we say in America, I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense, you should be born here, but what if you immigrated here and you've been here for several years? Why do you have to be born here?
Yeah, I mean, for a senator or representative, you don't have to be a natural-born citizen.
Well, this is when you back up to Deuteronomy. And what did God tell the Israelites? When you have someone rule over you, they need to be someone who's been born among you, a natural-born citizen. It's just interesting as we study the Constitution, as we study the men who gave us the Constitution, as we see they're people of faith and they did prayer proclamations and Bibles and Bible societies, all the things as we study the Constitution itself has even been shaped by principles from the Bible.
And it's interesting that even some of our most secular Supreme Court justices acknowledge that. For example, Justice Stephen Breyer, and no one is going to say he's a religious man because there's been no evidence of that at all. He's one of the more secular justices we've had. Even he says, of course, we all know that the due process clauses in the Bill of Rights came out of the Bible. Oh, do we?
Yeah, I remember when he said that, we were going, we didn't know that's what, oh, that's so interesting. And he even said where to find information on it.
And it turns out it's in this. It's called the Federal Practice and Procedure. Now, if you practice federal law, you recognize this. This is a set of volumes that go way, way down the road. So, I mean, it's a long set. But volume 30 is on the rules of evidence. And as you go into what he talked about, this talks about how that indeed all the due process clauses in the Bill of Rights, and that's the 4th through the 8th Amendment, the right to a trial by jury, the right to confront your accusers, the right to compel witnesses in your behalf, the right not to incriminate yourself, you can't have hearsay testimony, all of that goes back to this. And this Federal Practice and Procedure says, well, it all goes back to 2 other books. And it goes back to the Geneva Bible, which is the Bible the Pilgrims and Puritans brought to America. This is a 1599 Geneva Bible. But Geneva Bible is famous because of all the commentaries that go down the sides of the pages. And these commentaries, they were at the time, this was done back in the 1500s, they were saying, man, we have not been following the Bible for 1,000 years. And so here they said, look, in the justice system in Europe is not doing what the Bible says on justice. And so the commentaries pointed out how that the European justice system was doing it wrong. And so this is the right way to do justice according to the Bible. Well, this is what the Pilgrims and Puritans brought to America, and they start a new legal system quite different from that of Europe. They said the other that all Americans knew thoroughly was Fox's Book of Martyrs. Now, Fox's Book of Martyrs, this is a listing, this was done in the 1500s, and this is a listing of all of those who have been martyred for the Christian faith. And guess who the first martyr of the Christian faith was?
Well, Jesus.
Jesus. He's martyr number 1 in the book. And then it lists all the martyrs of the Christian faith. And interesting thing, all these people who got put to death wrongly were put to death by government because government did not use due process rights. Even the trial of Jesus was not conducted according to the laws at the time. So they point out, here's what courts have done bad. The Bible says, here's what courts are supposed to do. Here's what justice is supposed to look like. And so we get to confront our accusers, which according to the Federal Practice and Procedure comes out of John 8:10. Even Jesus said to the woman, where's your accuser? You're supposed to be able to confront your accusers.
Well, if no one condemns you, well, then neither do I.
That's it. And then we get to compel witnesses on our behalf because the Bible says, Proverbs 18:17, one side sounds good until you hear the other side. So the prosecution doesn't get to present all the witnesses. So all these provisions we have in due process clause, even Justice Breyer acknowledges that they come out of the Bible. So there's so much on Constitution Day that we just don't think about anymore. So much that goes back to men of faith, that goes back to the Bible, the influence of the Bible. It's not a secular document in the sense that we're told today. It really is a document that's faith-filled and it's built on faith.
There's no doubt that these were guys who certainly influenced by faith. And we could argue today, well, maybe not all of them were Christians, but it's pretty clear that the vast majority were people of faith. In fact, if you want to know more about the Constitution, a pretty good thing to do, Constitution Day, is to read the Constitution.
That's right.
Maybe if you read it and go, I really don't understand a lot of what I'm reading, we actually have something that might be very helpful for you. It's called Constitutional Life, where we actually go through and give a big picture of what the Constitution looks like, of how it operates, and actually show a lot of original documents explaining how the process works. And as we've even mentioned, the Bible shaped so much of the Constitution. We have a Bible that's called the Founder's Bible. And in this, we actually document when they talk about how a verse shaped a policy, a law, education, government, we put their quote beside the verse. So not only are you able to read the Bible, which every Christian should read the Bible, so that's another thing we'd encourage you to do. Make sure you're reading the Bible.
That's right.
But in the midst of reading the Bible, you can see how the Bible literally shaped our nation with the original quotes from the founding fathers themselves. But on Constitution Day, we would definitely encourage, take this time to get to know some of the guys who gave us a Constitution, learn more about the Constitution, our system of government, and you'll understand a little more about why America has been such a special nation.
James Madison is very attached to the Christian faith. In fact, after he finished at Princeton, he graduated, he spent an extra year there studying under the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon. He studied Hebrew and he studied ethics. Looked like he's studying for the ministry. And he told one of his friends there at Princeton, he said, look, you need to be really bold about your faith. Everybody needs to know that you're a Christian. And actually that guy became an Attorney General of the United States, William Bradford. And then he came back and got involved in Virginia politics, and he actually is one of the guys who helps write the original Virginia Constitution of 1776. And in that Virginia Constitution, they helped start disestablishing the Anglican Church, because here in Virginia, the state-established church was the Anglican Church. And so if you were a Baptist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian or a Quaker or something else, you were persecuted, you were fined, in some cases you were even killed, you were jailed because you're not of the Anglican denomination, you don't have an Anglican license. Well, Madison started pushing against that. In 1779, it was Thomas Jefferson who introduced the Virginia Statute on Religious Liberties to put all Christian denominations on the same equal footing. It didn't get passed, but later James Madison picks that up. He does a great piece called the Memorial and Remonstrance, where he goes through and lays out all the principles of religious liberty, that free exercise of religion, that's an inalienable right given by God. It's not granted by government, so we have to recognize what God's given us. And that bill eventually gets passed in 1784. What Jefferson started, Madison helped get finished. And Madison's also a member of the Continental Congress. And as a member of the Continental Congress, they appropriated money where they actually paid missionaries to go work among Native American tribes. And then after we move into the federal government, Madison is there to help with the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, guaranteeing religious liberty. He also is there to help make sure that the chaplains actually are paid by federal funds, and so we have chaplains in the House and Senate. And then you move into the time when he's Secretary of State. As Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, what he's able to do is he administers what's going on in Washington, D.C., and so they start church services at the War Department and at the Treasury Department and at the Navy Yard. And when he becomes President of the United States, it's interesting to see where James Madison attended church. He attended church at the U.S. Capitol, because every Sunday the Hall of the House of Representatives became a church, and up to 2,000 people a week would meet there. And visitors and observers said that James Madison would come in with a big carriage and white horses, so it was really obvious when President Madison got there to church. And then as President of the United States, we were in the War of 1812, on numerous occasions he actually issued calls for days of fasting and prayer because of the war we were in, so he turned to God openly, publicly. He also was a lifetime member of the Virginia Bible Society, and he even signed a bill that Congress passed to economically assist a Bible Society in importing Bibles into America, the Philadelphia Bible Society. So he was a strong and open professor of the Christian faith. So Madison had a very open, very public life with lots of religious activities, lots of religious belief expressions, lots of public church attendance, and other things that he did with both state and federal governments. And when he came back here after he retired as president, somewhere over the next 3 years, he wrote what is now called the Detached Memorandum. And it may have been a policy paper he was working on. It may be something he intended for distribution, maybe not. But for whatever reason, it flat didn't get out. But in it, he kind of backtracked from some things he's been doing. So I'm not sure that chaplains ought to be paid by federal monies. Have chaplains, but just not federal monies. And I don't know that you really need national proclamation for days of prayer. And these are all things he did. And so now he's looked like he's backtracking from that. And the first time ever that paper was published was in 1946. And when it came out, that was the middle of kind of the judicial activism that was going on at the time, where courts were starting to say, hey, let's be secular, let's get religion out of schools. And so some courts latched onto that and said, oh, look what James Madison said. He said you shouldn't have the government involved with religion, and that means you shouldn't be praying at schools, and that means you shouldn't have God at graduate. And so they started going in that tone, in that direction. They're using James Madison as the guy. There's so many guys involved with writing the Constitution. 55 wrote it, 39 signed it, 90 guys did the Bill of Rights. There's a whole bunch of guys that did it, and suddenly Madison's the only spokesman for it. And not only are they just using that piece, the Detached Memorandum, they're ignoring the other 40 years that came before, all the public things he did, all of his other writings. And so instead of looking at the entirety of what he did and trying to figure out how it comes together, they just took that one piece and said, oh, that's it, we can't have prayer in schools anymore. And at that point is when the courts and others started calling him the chief architect of the Constitution. Now, granted, he was a really important guy, and he's one of 5 that used to be called the master builders of the Constitution. You had 5 guys really important. You had George Washington and James Wilson and Roger Sherman and Charles Pinckney and James Madison. But Madison wasn't the guy. As a matter of fact, he made 70 motions at the Constitutional Convention, and 40 of them were voted down by the other delegates. Now, he's a huge influence, no question about it. But today, we consider him to be the chief architect, the only guy responsible. That's just not historically what's there. And when you look at Madison, this is another one of those things that people are complicated. They're not just one single letter here, one there. You got 40 years of behavior, and then you got the detached memoranda, and you have to kind of put all that together and see how it works out. But it's interesting the way that we latch onto one thing today, like that detached memoranda, and suddenly he's the only guy capable of speaking about the Constitution. So in looking at James Madison, very notable, very famous founding father, huge significance. He was born in 1751, and he graduated from Princeton 20 years later, 1771. And within 5 years, he was intimately involved in the American Revolution. He came back here to Orange County, and in Orange County, they elected him to the Committee of Safety, 1776, and they sent him to the Constitutional Convention to write the very first Constitution for Virginia. He's then elected to the first legislature under that Constitution, but then they send him on to the National Congress, and he's a member of the Continental Congress, and so while he's there, Continental Congress governs itself under the Articles of Confederation. And so he sees that that National Congress, that document, really, it's not a very good document. It just is terrible to work under for all the states. And so he sees firsthand that we need some kind of a different document. And so he starts working over the next years, going to the Annapolis Convention, helping build consensus to come up with a different government, different document. He wrote a piece calling for a new government, new document, and that leads to eventually the Constitutional Convention. Virginia sends him as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and while he's there, he's really the chief scribe. He's the guy that kept notes more than anybody else on all the debates, all the arguments, how the Constitution came to be, who was there and what they said. And so he is very active in that convention. As a matter of fact, his ideas that he introduced, one of the things that he helped introduce is what's called the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan said, hey, let's not just tinker around the edges with the Articles of Confederation. Let's just get rid of it and do something totally new, totally different. So George Washington from Virginia stood up and told the delegates, you need to be really bold. We need to do something different. So as they keep moving toward the Constitution, when they finally get it done, he's one of the guys who helps get it ratified. He writes what's called the Federalist Papers. Now, Congress is meeting in New York, and the Federalist Papers are written and run in newspapers across New York to convince people that we need to ratify the Constitution. So James Madison served in the first Congress. He served in the next 3 Congresses. He was in Congress for 8 years, all under George Washington. While he was in Congress, he married his wife, Dolly Payne. And after finishing those 8 years in Congress, he goes home. Then his friend Thomas Jefferson gets elected as the 3rd President of the United States, and James Madison comes back to be the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson. And then James Madison becomes the 4th President of the United States. And while James Madison is president, we get involved in the War of 1812. It went from 1812 to 1815, war against the British. We win that, he gets that settled, and then he goes right back to war again. 1815 and 1816, it's a war against Muslim terrorists. It was part of 32 years that America ended up fighting Muslim terrorists, began in 1784, and it ended in 1816 under James Madison. So when you look at James Madison, he was involved in so many key aspects of early American history. He was one of the key founding fathers to help produce the form of government that we still enjoy today, over 200 years later. He is a significant founding father to be observed on Constitution Day.
We're in New York right now, actually in Central Park. Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, who actually very largely responsible for a lot of us even having the Constitution. His statue's right behind me, which is appropriate. Being from New York, they're celebrating Alexander Hamilton. Well, he's a name that a lot of people have at least become familiar with today, but really we don't know much of his story, and it really is fascinating. He was born in the West Indies, 1757. His mom and dad had kind of a weird situation. Dad leaves mom. Dad really wasn't a good guy, so he grows up in kind of a single-parent home. His mom died when he was 11. Well, at that point, he's more or less an orphan. He's got some family, some aunts that are very supportive. Well, he's very ambitious. He wants to get a formal education, so they send him to America. From the West Indies, he gets to New York, and actually, when he gets to New York, he's a young teenager. He meets some individuals who would later go on to sign the Declaration, the Constitution, what we would call founding fathers. And in the midst of their relationship, they're encouraging him to think differently, even about the notion of the British and oppression. And so he really joins on the American side, becomes an early activist, starts university at King's College, which became Columbia College. But shortly after he started college, the American Revolution starts to break out. As the revolution is now unfolding, it interrupts his school, but he decides, you know what, I'm gonna do something, I'm gonna get involved. At 17, he actually joined with another founding father, and they started a militia when he was 17, and so the following year he decides, I wanna do this for real. As an 18-year-old, he gets his first official commission from the U.S. government to be an officer. He's actually over an artillery company. Well, at this time, he's 18, so he's still a very young officer. But Robert Morris, who's a founding father, introduces him to George Washington. Washington's super impressed with this Hamilton kid, brings Hamilton on to be part of his staff. He's the aide-de-camp for General George Washington. Washington promotes him to be a lieutenant colonel. Throughout the Revolution, him and Washington are very good friends, and he's giving Washington strategies and thoughts and ideas for how they can improve military and what they can do different. So Hamilton and Washington become very good friends during the Revolution. In fact, Hamilton comes up with a lot of ideas for ways they can improve the military, things they should do different. Washington embraces the ideas, and they were very good friends until there was a bit of a falling out. Hamilton was supposed to meet Washington. He shows up late, and Washington scolds him for being late, as he should have been scolded for being late. Hamilton used this opportunity. Really, I say use the opportunity. He really was frustrated. He made it a big scene, kind of an emotional deal. But a lot of people believe he was trying to get out from under Washington because he wanted to be a commander of military, not just on military intelligence. He wanted to go out in the field and fight. So he used the opportunity to say, you know what, I just shouldn't be with you anymore. Well, Washington very graciously, instead of punishing him maybe as he would have deserved for his behavior and actions, Washington just reassigns him. He puts him under General Lafayette, and he's signed over infantry under Lafayette. Well, this is 1781. This is where the last major battle of the Revolution happens, the Battle of Yorktown. Hamilton's very involved and does some really neat things there, being very successful as a commander. But when we defeated Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, it was kind of the end of the Revolution. And so at this point, Hamilton decides that he's going to retire to private life. He goes back home, starts studying law. He actually studies for 5 months and then takes and passes the bar to become a lawyer. Well, he then is chosen to go back to the Continental Congress to represent his state. And this is 1783, so this is the very end of the Revolution. This is when we signed the Peace Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolution. So he's only there for a year. He then goes back and he starts his law practice, becomes very successful, pretty lucrative. He's doing very well, but the whole time he's practicing law, he's trying to tell the people of New York and America, we need a stronger central government. The Articles of Confederation, which is what they were under at the time, just weren't strong enough. He says, we need a convention to write a new constitution. Well, in 1787, there was a convention. And what they did was they wrote a new constitution. During the Constitutional Convention, he wasn't there for the whole time. He was still very involved in law. He was going home. He was working on his law practice, but he was there to sign the Constitution. After the Constitution was signed, however, it had to be ratified by the states. And at this point, New York was not in favor of ratifying it. It was at this time that James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton wrote this. This is the Federalist Papers. Now, there's 85 different articles and essays in the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of them by himself and actually contributed on many others. So he's the guy that's the most responsible for the Federalist Papers. Well, New York finally goes in and they decide they're going to ratify the Constitution. So we finally become a nation under the Constitution. George Washington is chosen to be our president. Alexander Hamilton is then chosen to be the first secretary of the Treasury Department. In fact, under Hamilton, we start the National Bank, and there's a lot of other things that happen under Hamilton. In fact, if you've ever seen a $10 bill, the reason it has Hamilton on it is because he's the guy responsible for even some of our money. In fact, on the back it has the Treasury Department. Well, Hamilton does a lot as a leader under Washington, but after several years he decides, I really want to retire, go back to private life. I want to go back to being an attorney. So he resigns from serving under Washington and goes back to become an attorney in New York. But he's still very politically active. In fact, he opposes John Adams on many situations, opposed Thomas Jefferson, opposed James Madison. There was a lot of things they were doing he just didn't like, so he's very politically engaged. He really kind of was an agitator at times. He was a firebrand, was very willing to tell you exactly what he thought all the time, which wasn't always popular. In fact, one of the things that became very famous, Thomas Jefferson was running for president in the election of 1800. Aaron Burr was also running for president. At that time, the president would not pick his vice president. Whoever got the most votes would be the president. Whoever got the second most votes would be the vice president. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied for the presidency. Now, when it ties, it goes to the U.S. Congress, and the House takes a vote on who's going to be the president. Hamilton used his influence that even though he didn't like Jefferson, he said, Burr is even worse. This man is terrible, he's dangerous, he's corrupt, which actually all those things turned out to be true, but Burr hated and despised him because he kept Burr from being president. Well, Burr was the first vice president under Thomas Jefferson, and under Jefferson, Burr decides he wants to run for governor of New York. So he runs for governor of New York in 1804, but this is where Alexander Hamilton lives. Hamilton goes, this is terrible. We don't need this guy to be our governor. He's so bad. And so he opposes his election for governor. Burr doesn't become governor, but Burr is so offended, he challenges Hamilton to a duel. Hamilton wrote, and he said, I know that this guy wants to kill me, but I don't want to kill him. He said, so I'm going to fire my first round just in the air. I'm not going to shoot him. He said, in fact, I'm even willing to fire my second round in the air. Now, I don't know how that really works. Like maybe if both guys missed the first shot, let's try again, let's take a second shot, apparently. But he said, I'm going to fire both shots, neither one at Aaron Burr. Well, what he also knew was that if this is the end of his life, this is something he wants to be ready for eternity. He actually called for a couple pastors, and they came and they met with him, and he said, I want to take communion. And they said, well, we're happy to give you communion. Now, he was a lifelong Episcopal. So he's part of the Episcopal Church, and these were Episcopal ministers, and they said, we're happy to give you communion, but we need to understand that you know exactly what communion means, because that you have to repent of your sins, you have to believe in God, you have to believe in the atoning work of Jesus. He said, I believe in all those things. They gave him communion. He then goes out and he has a duel. Aaron Burr shoots him right in the stomach, and this is a fatal injury. He died shortly after that. Those same two ministers, he called them back, and they came and they prayed with him. He took communion again. A lot of interesting things at the end of his life, knowing it was the end of his life. And as I say this, there's a lot more to the story of Hamilton, and today a lot of people only know a few details. Hamilton actually at one point in his life did have an affair. And there's some not good things about his life. It's not dissimilar from like a story of King David, or if you look at King David, there's some moments when he does really great things and moments he doesn't. All founding fathers were people, so not dissimilar from even the heroes we read in the Bible. Hamilton's a great example of a guy like that, who certainly, he had flaws in his life, certainly there's things that weren't good, but he's the guy who, without his work on the Federalist Papers, we might not have ever had a constitution, we might not have ever become a nation. This guy's largely responsible not only for the ratification of the Constitution, but for America becoming a lot of who we became. By the way, shortly before his death, he started a new society, a constitutional society for electing Christians who would uphold the Constitution. He says the best thing we need, that the thing we need the most, is Christians who will follow the Constitution, uphold the values. He says Christians will do that the best. We need more Christians involved. This is part of Hamilton's legacy that today, sadly, we just don't know much about. But without Hamilton, we might not have even become a nation.
So today you've seen some of the hidden history of these signers of the U.S. Constitution, something about their lives and their families and their accomplishments, their great wisdom. And by the way, we've only scratched the surface. I mean, you had 55 guys at the Constitutional Convention, you had 39 who signed the document, and we've just looked at a few of them. But you see something of the wisdom they had in crafting the Constitution that now is the gold standard for the rest of the world. No one's been under a Constitution as long as we've been under this Constitution. What a blessing. If you want to learn more about what you've seen today, you can catch us at wallbuilders.com. We've got all the social media outlets you can use. There's a lot more information you can learn about Constitution Day. In the meantime, stay tuned to TBN for another exciting episode of America's Hidden History.